So Corsair have launched a brand new mid-tower case at CES this year called the Spec Omega, and I was lucky enough to have it land on the review table a few days ago, and the first thing I noticed was just how different this case looks to your typical ATX mid-tower enclosure. The Omega is a bit of a hybrid between the Spec Alpha and the 460X, which were both pretty successful mid-tower cases from Corsair last year, and the result is a very unique looking enclosure that Corsair are offering for $99 US. And so the ultimate question is it worth it? Well, starting on the exterior, we have a few options when it comes to the color scheme. White and black that you see here, which is personally my favorite, but there's also a red and black option and a complete black model as well, both with red illumination on the front or the white illumination on my model, which by the way I think looks pretty awesome and complements the matte paint very nicely. The lighting uniformity is perfect and does add a little bit more life to the system, but unfortunately we are stuck with a single color here and it's not the RGB that we were hoping for. The sharp angles continue throughout the design, and to achieve these unique shapes we are of course working with an injection molded plastic here on the front and top panel, so don't expect the best build quality, but the rest of the case is made of steel and tempered glass, which is pretty nice. And one of the main selling points of the Spec Omega is that tempered glass panel on the front, which while looking pretty cool does come at a cost of reduced airflow, which we will soon see. In fact, the only ventilation for the front panel at all on the Omega is this tiny little segment at the bottom here, which is quite a disappointment in regards to airflow and proper cooling. Front I/O is pretty standard: power and reset button, mic and headphone jack, and two USB 3.0 ports. Placement is good at the top right hand corner and no complaints here. And for a size comparison, here's the Spec Omega next to two of my favorite mid-tower cases at the moment, the Meshify C from Fractal Design on the left and the Silverstone RL06 on the right. Both go for that compact mid-tower look that I really love, especially the Meshify C, which is the smallest of the three, and the Omega is both taller and longer than the other cases. Now the feet design are a little bit weird too, if I'm honest, and I don't like how far they reach out from the front and back of the case. They kind of give the Omega an organic look, like it's ready to start walking away from you, and overall the stance of the case is just a bit odd. And another odd move from Corsair, which I hope does not stick around, are these hex screws for the tempered glass side panel. I seriously do not know why they would not just stick with the good old thumb screws that we all love, or maybe do something similar to the Fractal Design Define R6 with its sliding mechanism. Having to tighten the panel on with a tool is extremely problematic and awkward, and after removing and reinstalling the panel several times over the course of this review, I can easily say that thumb screws are better in every single way. It also doesn't help that there's nothing really for the panel to sit on while you're tightening or taking it off, and the glass is just sort of left to sit there on the feet. The top panel follows the front panel very closely in design with angled geometry, and at least here we are getting a little bit of access to fresh air, but it's still a shame that the majority of it is cut off by the angled design. The side panel on the flip side is of course steel, and I actually would have preferred if they just made this out of plastic as well, as we get this weird clash of textures going on between the plastic panels on the top and the front clashing with the texture of the steel. It's not incredibly bad, I've definitely seen worse, but it's still noticeable nonetheless. And I guess Corsair kind of accepted that airflow was pretty minimal from the top and front panels because there aren't any dust filters included here, which is pretty unacceptable for a case in this price range. But at least we are getting one underneath the power supply, which by the way is kept in plain sight the entire time because there is no shroud to hide it. And this is one of the biggest oversights of the Spec Omega in my opinion. We've got tempered glass on the front and the side, LED illumination, but not even a power supply shroud to hide your ugly cables or 3.5-inch drives. Speaking of drives, I'm a big fan of the toolless installation of both the 2.5-inch and 3.5-inch drive bays. You can fit up to 3 2.5-inch drives in these spring-loaded slots here, which are a real pleasure to use. Just pull the tab and they'll slide right in. And we've got two 3.5-inch drives which also slide in nicely into the bays underneath. Installation takes less than 10 seconds, which is really awesome. Now for fans, we've got two 120mm fans included, the LED at the front which is configured as intake and the one in the rear which is configured as exhaust. And in total we've got support for up to 3 120mm fans or two 140mm fans at the front, allowing for up to a 360 or 280mm radiator. For a top mounted configuration though, we've got two 120mm fans or 140mm fans, but only support for up to a 240mm radiator, as there will be clearance issues with a 280. Okay, enough of that, let's look at how the system actually performs. Alright, so build is now finished. I decided to go with the Ryzen 5 1600 processor for this one and the GTX 1060. I wanted to stick with the stock cooler here as well, seeing as that's what most people seem to be doing with their Ryzen processors, and I have overclocked this to 3.8 GHz at 1.3 volts as well. The GTX 1060 is not overclocked, but the power limit is pushed all the way up to 116% to prevent any core clock deviation, and building inside the system was pretty easy. There's plenty of room inside the case to work with, and I really like the addition of these holes in the frame for better access to the expansion slots, which makes installation and removal of our PCI Express devices a whole lot easier. Cable management is pretty average though. The rubber grommets are too far away from the motherboard in my opinion, and I wish there was a little bit more room between the motherboard tray and the side panel here, because this is a little bit too tight for my likings. Alright, so let's finally talk about those system temperatures, and let's first look at CPU performance in Prime 95. I want to start with the bare chassis first to give you guys an idea of how the system performs without any restrictions from the panels. So this is just the bare frame with no panels installed at all, and we see that we're getting some pretty reasonable temperatures for the system, as you would expect. The timeline here spans 15 minutes, with the average result for the last 5 minutes here being 65.5 degrees C. Now let's compare that to the enclosure at stock. So this is essentially how most of you will be building inside the case, with all panels installed and fan placement untouched, and ideally we want this result to be as close to the bare chassis as possible, but as you can see, that's not what we're getting. Instead, the CPU warms up to 74.6 degrees C, which is almost a 10-degree delta compared to the bare frame. Now, for cases with superb airflow, we usually see a delta here of about 1 or 2 degrees, but this in my opinion is pretty unacceptable, especially when Corsair are advertising the airflow for this case as one of its main features. Now, this is where it starts to get a little bit weird. I wanted to test just how effective that front intake fan was, so I reran the same test with it removed, and I actually got better temperatures with it uninstalled. Yes, that's right. Removing the front fan actually improves your system temperatures. Granted, it is only a 1.5 degree improvement, but still it is an improvement, and this should not be happening at all. My guess is that since the front intake fan doesn't have any fresh air to pull in from the bottom or the front, it just has to pull it from the inside of the case, and this creates a bit of a turbulent effect which fights the CPU fan. I also removed the front panel with the fan still installed now, and we do get an improvement here as well, and this really highlights the restrictiveness of that front panel. So then I tried relocating the front intake fan to one of the top slots, thinking that it would have improved airflow again, but I found that this was just as restrictive with pretty much no improvement. And lastly, I flipped the rear exhaust fan to function as an intake fan just to see how that would go, but I still had no improvement. Alright, now for GPU temperatures we get a similar story, but to a lesser degree, as the GTX 1060 that we're using has pretty effective cooling already. Here the stock configuration out of the box is about 4 degrees warmer on average when compared to the bare chassis, and this is actually pretty good, but still we are able to reduce that slightly by removing that front fan, which is really annoying. Relocating the fan and changing the configuration only makes temperatures worse by about a degree or two, and then finally removing the front panel improves temperatures by about 4 degrees, just as we saw in our CPU tests. And so wrapping up this review, I'm struggling to make any airflow recommendations at all, seeing as the front panel is completely cut off from airflow except for the bottom here, and the top panel is pretty much half suffocated as well. So the bottom line is that for $99 US, there are much better options out there. So despite this being a really awesome looking case and it's unique, airflow is pretty bad. Unfortunately, we're not getting a power supply shroud. Cable management is fairly average, and the tempered glass side panel installation is really frustrating as well. And so drop your comments down below, guys. If you had $99 US to buy a mid-tower enclosure, what would you buy and why? Don't forget to subscribe if you want to see more content like this, and as always, I will see you all in the next one.